Over the last few months, I put out a series which focused on highlighting interesting and impressive driving games for the Commodore 64. From games which showcased thrilling uses of simulated vanishing point 3D, to those which made great use of scrolling courses, and of course, others which kept players engaged with tiny cars on single-screen tracks. As one might expect, there was plenty of interesting feedback on those videos, highlighting a bunch of titles that I hadn't considered in those roundups. Which brings me to the purpose of this video, in which I'm going to sit through most of those which are highlighted and give them another evaluation, to see whether they fit within the picks which I'd made previously. So now it's time to shift into gear and give this batch a second chance. This is Beyond the Scanlines, a series focusing on interesting games on classic computing and gaming platforms. We're going to start with the Vanishing Point 3D suggestions, and the first of those is English Software's Elektra Glide. In this fantasy racing experience, you're up against the clock as you race across courses set in one of three countries: the US, the UK, or Australia. As you race, you'll primarily focus on evading obstacles. These come in the forms of flying cubes, bouncing balls, and gigantic pillars, with the balls and the cubes needing the most attention due to how suddenly they'll appear on screen. This sadly isn't helped by the removal of one visual feature from the original Atari 8-bit version: the lack of a dividing line on the road. Elektra Glide is certainly a technical marvel though. The speed of the game in action has to be seen to be believed. The rapid rate at which the horizon visuals shift as you turn corners, or the updating of the road visuals, it's a game which truly pushes the C64 quite hard, even if it's not quite up there with that Atari original. Based on its technical performance, it's fair to say Elektra Glide would be worth adding to my original list. Though it's a shame the work put into the mechanics isn't quite as refined, resulting in it feeling incredibly frustrating at points, especially when it comes to colliding with multiple obstacles again and again and again after a crash. Next on the list, we have an early one with Tronix's Motocross, released all the way back in 1983. I'd not heard of this one at all previously, and based on the screens was really looking forward to checking it out. Visually, the high-resolution graphics modes are used well, making for something which is quite smooth, even when in motion, which is quite the strong point, because really, any Vanishing Point racer really needs to do this in order to make it fluid, controllable, and well worth checking out. It has to be said though, this is done with not too much scenery on screen. The dirt environment makes the only objects besides your bike which are moving just the barriers on the side, and which is where this one fell down for me. These were placed in such a way which made the track incredibly narrow. That alone doesn't sound like a problem, but when combined with the suddenness of oncoming corners, made learning the course near impossible because of the reaction time. After a while, the act of getting up to speed, hitting a barrier, and having to repeat the process again, starting from a crawl, really got old. This is a bit of a shame because motocross racing isn't really common on the C64, and it would have been nice to have something a bit different to include in the roundups. Moving back onto four wheels, we've got Night Racer, a 1988 release published by Masbartronic. In this one, you're running a late night rally through a twisty course within a very, very thick forest, which is a neat enough setup to start with. It also is what sets this one up to move pretty quickly, along with the reduced size of the view, but I digress. You'll be screaming down the roads with the goal being to keep up with your rival, whilst avoiding other vehicles which get in the way. If your rival makes it to the end of the leg before you do, a countdown will start ticking away, and if that reaches 0, your race is over, as your car explodes into a million pieces. The challenge here is being able to keep your speed up, especially as you negotiate your way around traffic on some tricky corners. Bumping into these cars will slow you down, but after a few attempts it can be a serious penalty, giving your rival some extra space ahead of you. It's the lack of detail here which excludes it from the list for me. The scenery feels kind of bland, and whilst that means there is less to update on screen to keep the speed up, But in the long run, I think there are other titles which keep the same kind of pace, or are even faster, whilst throwing more about on screen, which make for far more impressive efforts technically. The success of the conversions of the original Outrun gave US Gold an idea. If a sequel wasn't forthcoming, then why not create their own? Though this original concept would be shelved upon learning of Turbo Outrun, it would be revisited again in the form of Run Europa. It's not just about driving and enjoying the scenery this time, as instead, your special agent Simeon Kurtz against the clock to retrieve and deliver a set of stolen documents. That's not what you'd expect in an Outrun game, am I right? Nor would you expect the variety of vehicles, from motorcycles to jet skis, speedboats, and a variety of sports cars. Despite that, and the excessively high difficulty, it's a very well presented racer. The visuals feel like a major boost compared to the earlier games, and the pace of it all is very much up there. A neat visual tick I love is when you enter tunnels. It's minor, but seeing the colours of both your own and other vehicles become slightly darker is a very nice touch for sure. It's certainly a far more aggressive game than its predecessors as well, as you'll need to pick up both turbo boost power, used when on roads, along with ammo for when you're on the water as you race in order to complete each stage. It's one where shoehorning the Outrun name to it kind of hurt it, as it's quite a solid action racer, and really as a result is one that I think would probably have been worth adding to the list had I spent more time with it. It's certainly one that doesn't come up as much compared to some of the other games, both that I originally covered and got suggested. It's a conversion of an arcade hit next with Atarisoft's conversion of Namco's Pole Position. Unsurprisingly, this one is quite an early conversion to the C64, and it really shows with its incredibly chunky car visuals. Pole Position is as straightforward as it comes. You start out by setting your difficulty level, then the number of laps, then you finally hit the track at Fuji for some racing. You start off a qualifying lap in order to set a bonus, and your starting position, then it's about navigating the field and overtaking as many cars as possible, also while trying to complete the number of laps you set, before you run out of time. The controls are where this one falls down, as they feel incredibly sluggish at times, which can become a major problem to precision as you try to navigate your way through two rival cars without slowing down too much. Pole Position's importance to gaming history, particularly as one of the first Vanishing Point races, cannot be disputed. In its arcade form, it's still a great game to play, even after all this time. Though the C64 version mostly works from a technical angle, it ultimately is one which feels incredibly dated, especially coming up after all this time, and so it really doesn't fit on the list as far as I'm concerned. You would think for a machine originally developed in the US that there'd be more stock car racing games on the C64. In fact, there's only two, and the first of those is Richard Petty's Talladega, published by Cosmi in 1984. For a relatively early release, things are simple. You could race on a generic tri-oval layout, or have the game randomise it, and from there, you'll have to qualify to set your starting position. Once you've qualified, you've got 30 laps between you and the checkered flag as you race to avoid the traffic and try not to crash out in flames. The opposing traffic can be devious to get around, especially when you find yourself in a massive pack of drivers, which is really where this one could get seriously frustrating at times. There's nothing like managing to keep the lead for several laps, then find yourself trapped coming into a corner with no way to avoid a crash. Being such an early release on the Commodore 64, it truly lacks the polish we see with many other titles which are catalogued in the original video. Even then, it still offers so many unique mechanics which weren't included in many other racing games of the era, so perhaps it's still worth a look regardless. From one license to another, we have Leisure Genius's take on slot racing with Scalextric. The setup here is quite straightforward. Either alone or with a friend, you can race a number of laps over a given course. Said course can be one created using the game's track builder, or one of several recreations of real-life Formula 1 circuits. This is where the game honestly stands out, especially as the construction process is quite intuitive. When you hit the track though, the limitations are quite apparent, especially if you compare it to games like Pit Stop 2. The smaller areas which are presented for each player's view, the larger car sprites, and having only the 2 cars on course really makes it feel lifeless in comparison to that epic's classic. It doesn't discount the enjoyment you can get, however, especially when playing alongside a friend. But all up, Scalextric is one which doesn't really deserve a place on the list, as whilst its attempt at Vanishing Point 3D is solid, it's an unremarkable game, and having included Pit Stop 2 in the original roundup, I don't think a second game in that style is all that necessary, at least in my opinion. Time for another one from the budget vaults as we dive into Street Surfer, developed by Sculptured Software and published by Masbartronic on their Entertainment USA label. The title says it all really, as you're a kid on a skateboard simply needing to survive as long as possible, whilst you avoid traffic, obstacles and more. Each incident knocks you off your skateboard and saps away at your health, though you can replenish this in one of 2 ways. Firstly, taking drinks from passing drivers. Secondly, collecting empties located at the side of the road or from those drinks you've taken, and once you get to the end of each stage, you'll be a responsible citizen, disposing of the empties, collecting extra health as a reward. Though it doesn't need to run at speeds comparable to the likes of Elektra Glide, the pacing of Street Surfer is more than fine, as it gives you a good sensation of speed, and with quite a large amount of the screen dedicated to the updating of the road, it certainly is a well-presented title, even at a budget price point. All up, I'm not sure whether it's one to fit the list. Some of the other titles that I covered are significantly quicker in terms of the trickery and more impressive in a visual front, but don't let it stop you playing Street Surfer. It's quite a fun little budget experience. I think if there was any one title which I didn't include in our original video which got the most mentions, it's got to be System 3's 1991 release, Turbocharge. Now this is something I wasn't surprised by, as with the coding duties handled by Chris Butler, anyone who's seen Power Drift in action knows what his engine could pull off. Turbocharge adds to the detail presented there, with far more detailed scenes on screen, and a wider variety of visuals as a result. Now granted, it doesn't have to fit into a single load the way Power Drift does, and the results are easily worth the extra loading. At least if you're playing on disc, of course. It also plays excellently, racing to take out terrorists, avoiding road hazards, and collecting fuel. The pace of this game and its mechanics really do keep you on edge, taking out as many enemies as possible in the first phase leading up to the border crossing, then going out to take out a terrorist leader in the second phase. As for whether it takes a place on the original list, it gets complicated. When I put the original video together, the idea was to focus on racing games. Whilst Turbocharge is easily up there with many of the other titles I showcased, I feel that rule and sticking to it is enough to keep it off. Don't let that stop you checking it out though, because let's face it, who needs lackluster arcade conversions when we have original titles as thrilling as this in the Commodore 64's library? The final Vanishing Point racer in this list is the actual sequel to Outrun. Well, the first of them anyway, in the form of 1989's Turbo Outrun, converted by Probe and published by US Gold. As we'd see in Run Europa, it's not quite a pure driving experience here, but rather a head-to-head race across America split up into 16 stages. This does result in Outrun's famous branching courses being ditched, as this is now a linear journey, but it does provide more opportunities for fancy scenery to blast by. The main selling point with Turbo Outrun is in the title, that being the turbo system fitted to your car. This can be activated at any point, slowly pushing up your engine temperature, and once it reaches the overheat section, you'll have to let it cool down before you can use it again. It adds a tactical element to the driving mechanics, as you're going to need to employ it at certain points to get through obstacles without losing too much of your speed. But of course, if you're not careful, you'll crash into the side of the road and spin out from improper use. Though the game is quite a bit easier than Run Europa, and it's not quite as nice a looker in comparison, though it's got to be said it's also not quite as smooth as the port of the original Outrun, and whilst it's genuinely a nice comfort game, particularly for myself, it's not one I'd squeeze into the list, even after this re-evaluation. In fact, I would easily put Run Europa above it, despite the difficulty of that game. We've had arcade conversions, tie-ins to slot car racing toys, and tie-ins to top-tier stock car drivers. But the one thing we haven't had yet is a movie tie-in. Though, as we move to cover the suggested overhead driving games, we now do in the form of Give My Regards to Broad Street, Mind Games' 1985 tie-in to the movie, released the previous year. This one isn't about racing on courses, rather you're up against the clock, driving across London to find the people who were present when your album was recorded, in order to recover enough pieces to reconstruct it. It sounds like a setup which would make for a tense game. Beat the clock, find out where these people are, and get to them in time. But from the setup, the game is a major letdown. The roads are incredibly narrow, making navigating them at speed quite tough. Beyond the fact, there's the fact that tracking your contacts down becomes a mess as the on-screen indicators overwhelms the new player, and not in a way which inspires them to want to investigate putting more time into this game to learn it and work out what to do. The worst factor is the controls. They're incredibly stiff, and if you mess up a turn, it takes an eternity to get back into the right direction and back to driving at speed. All up, even if the main objective wasn't infuriating to complete, and it had a solid set of controls and a map layout, it might have made it work, somewhat, but sadly it's not the case at all here, and it's one that absolutely is not worthy of being included on the list, even after another review. And of course, let's not mention that music. Not mention it at all. It's another one from the arcades now, with Capcom's Leadstorm, adapted by Software Creations and published by US Gold on their Go label in 1989. It's tough to say adapted though, as it's based on an interim version of the arcade game which has little resemblance to the final version. The goal is to race through 9 stages of city and off-road challenges, avoiding your rivals and messes of traffic whilst collecting fuel tanks to spell out energy and refuel your tanks, as that's where the game ends. If anything with this one, the challenge is really learning the placement of these fuel tanks and avoiding the sheer chaos presented by the hazards on the road, especially with the off-road stages where there's no guiding road to point the way to the end, leaving an unwary player to crash into scenery on far too many occasions, unless you've memorised it to a T. Unlike many of US Gold's conversions during this period, Leadstorm is of seriously high quality. The presentation, visuals, controls, and audio are all top-notch and make for a great package in their combined forms, especially the audio. All that makes it well worth checking out, but as for whether it's worth a spot on the list, for me the feelings of being overwhelmed when trying to play it kind of discount it for me, though honestly, I think it's one which is certainly more than worthy of your place to check out and have fun with. Race Ace has got to have the most interesting background of any of the games featured in this roundup, because it's the only one which is a type-in. Its author Mike Sedor had it published in Compute's Gazette in 1990. Now this one takes on the style of racer which inspired games like Le Mans, pitting you against the clock and trying to complete the stages before you run out of time. Considering it's just a type-in, you might think it would be a fairly simple game all up. And it's surprisingly not. As with its inspiration, you'll have a variety of environments to negotiate, ranging from normal roads, driving in the desert, screaming through tunnels, and even across icy roads. Now this is where the game really stood out for me, and it's all because of the handling. Compared to Le Mans, you could truly feel the car slipping and sliding as you try to avoid traffic. It makes these sequences that bit more terrifying for sure. On top of that, the traffic offers way more variety in how one must approach them to overtake, as they don't just randomly bounce from side to side now. Some can stick to their lanes, others will shift about in a slightly unpredictable pattern. Race Ace is certainly a surprising effort for an overhead racer. It's not the prettiest release out of the games I featured, but I really found it a great deal of fun to sit down with, and its joystick controls make it far more approachable than Le Mans, and thus more convenient to play. Granted, I really do love the paddle controls in Le Mans, but paddles aren't as widespread as joysticks, and all up, I think this deserves the nod in place of it. Now on to the final section of this video, in which I'm going to take a look at the single screen racing games which were suggested. And the first of these is Domark's Badlands, a 1990 conversion of the Atari game's follow-up to Super Sprint, which the first track is certainly not afraid to show, because you can sum up Badlands as what if Super Sprint but after the apocalypse, which means you know how it plays out. Race across a series of tracks, aiming to finish ahead of the AI drivers whilst picking up wrenches. These are of course used to upgrade your car between races, and not only in the traditional areas, but also by letting you add missiles. That's right, if your opponents just cause too much pain on the track, you can fire missiles at them to temporarily knock them out. Except I found it a little too fiddly to actually use them, which means you're not going to use them and buy them, so you're back to the default machine guns, which are even less useful than the missiles, so it's back to winning by pure racing mechanics for sure. The post-apocalyptic visuals certainly don't make it as attractive visually compared to Super Sprint, and the decision to include weapons also means you can collide into other drivers, and it ratchets up the frustrations as a result. Ultimately, I feel like I could sit down with Super Sprint and get far more enjoyment out of its challenge compared to Badlands, though I should say if you could rope a friend in, I'm sure you can make some fun out of it for sure. The next single screen racer is one of those which I'm sure is fairly highly regarded. Codemasters' debut title, BMX Simulator. Across a series of 7 tracks, you'll be racing against the clock, aiming to complete a number of laps before running out of time. Whilst BMX courses make for a unique racing venue, it could certainly make things challenging, which is quite an impressive bit of work for an 8-bit micro to pull off. You'll need to be careful as you take corners, or negotiate obstacles, as if you do it wrong, you can lose a lot of time getting back on your feet. A situation which is usually made worse, as you'll typically be facing the wrong way when you restart, and your bike's sluggish turning circle delays you getting back up to speed as a result. For what it's worth, I think it's the lesser of the Codemasters single screen races, with the precision needed, making it far more fiddly and less fun than those other titles. But of course, everyone has to start out somewhere, that's for certain. Again, it's one where having a second player to play with would make it far more enjoyable, as at least you could scream at them, instead of doing it in your heart as you get thrown off your bike for the umpteenth time. Which brings us to the final game I'd like to check out in this video. And it's the follow-up to BMX Simulator, Pro BMX Simulator. The setup is once again similar to that of the first game. Race across a series of courses, try to complete a set number of laps before you run out of time. But unsurprisingly, Pro BMX Simulator turns things up all the way to 11. Firstly, you can now have 4 players in-game, which adds to the challenge by letting you have 3 friends to scream out once again when you suffer one too many annoying collisions. The big upgrade is in the courses. You don't just have dirt courses as in the original game, but can now race on courses set in a quarry or in the desert. Each of these requires a completely different approach to how you race them, and can bring much more frustration and unwary crashes for the newbie player. Much like the original BMX Simulator, I find Pro BMX Simulator to be endlessly frustrating to sit down with. It's a game which is technically well crafted, with well done visuals and audio, but its mechanics require absolute mastery right from the get-go, and the ease of getting into an utterly unrecoverable position takes the fun out of wanting to learn it. So, whilst it's one which would be worth including in the list, at least on a technical front, I would easily go back to the other Cody's single-screen racing games every time, as their mechanics are just that much more refined and far more enjoyable as a result. Which brings this little review session to a close. The catalogue of racing and driving games for the Commodore 64 is certainly wider than what I've showcased across the original 3 videos, in addition to the ones I've highlighted just now. There are, of course, many others out there which are likely deserving of a mention, and plenty of others which aren't. Now though, I'd truly like to think that I can wave the checkered flag on this, showing that in fact the Commodore 64 is more than a match for handling some interesting, challenging and fast racing games, no matter the style. So if you enjoyed this piece, and in fact the entire series, do consider hitting that thumbs up on the video and perhaps help to spread the word about this one. Word of mouth helps out ever so much in introducing new folks to smaller channels which are out there. If the idea of chilled examinations of interesting titles both old and new for classic systems tickles your fancy, do think about hitting the subscribe button as well. And sit back as the videos enter your subscription box. Special thanks as always go to the channel's supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible. And if you like what you see and would like to contribute as well, do check the links out in the video description. Finally, and most importantly, thank you all for taking another voyage beyond the Scanlines.